What would our world be like if antibiotics were ineffective? It's likely that most of us would not be alive. According to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, 1.27 million people died in 2019 from antibiotic resistance. The discovery of the first modern antibiotic therapy in 1928 by Alexander Fleming felt like a breakthrough. It saved the lives of many soldiers who suffered bullet wounds from the war and were more likely to die because of the infection that developed than from the wound itself. That is until antibiotic resistance became widespread in the 1940s. Antibiotic resistance has been a global medical obstacle for almost a century. The pattern of antibiotic resistance following the development of newly discovered antibiotics has resulted in an urgent need for long-term solutions to the spread of antimicrobial bacteria. Ultimately, what is at stake here is human lives. The survival of resistant bacteria is a global health threat that could someday lead to complete antibiotic resistance if preventative measures are not taken. Staphylococcus aureus is a potent bacteria that is resistant to almost all antibiotics, leading to the death of some 50,000 people in the U.S. each year, warns John Green in his essay collection, The Anthropocene Reviewed. Staph infections are common but serious, mainly spreading through skin-to-skin contact. Biofilm, which is essentially a community of bacteria, is responsible for staph infections. In the Journal of Infection and Public Health, authors Ferri, Kumbar, and Boutin maintain the dangers of biofilm growth, a bacteria highly resistant to antibiotics. However, they argue that biofilms can be prevented by antibiotic prophylaxis or early aggressive antibiotic therapy, and they can be treated by chronic suppressive antibiotic therapy. In other words, the danger of biofilms in medicine is threatening, but there are promising preventative solutions to mitigate the effects of antibiotic resistance. Prescribing antibiotics in high-risk situations, for instance after surgery or before an infection has occurred, can help lower the risk of biofilm forming in the first place. Plastered on the door of the women's locker room at the Costella Sports Complex in Gorham, Maine, is a warning about staph infections. The sentence on the paper that my eyes were repeatedly drawn to was, "If you are given an antibiotic, take the entire dose." These words acknowledge the risk of antibiotic resistance that occurs without the proper dosage of the medication being taken by a patient. It made me wonder how people in underprivileged countries administer antibiotics, if there are barriers to affording medications and quality medical treatment. Death as a result of infection in the developing world is widespread, and combating the spread of infection is a critical problem many countries face. The use of antibiotics helps mitigate infection rates, but the lack of regulation around antibiotic medication in developing countries often leads to antibiotic resistance, which is at the cost of many lives. A study in the British Medical Journal reports that in the Rajbari district of Bangladesh, there was an inconsistent dispensary of antibiotics to patients, meaning many of them were unable to take the complete round. If there is widespread and uncontrolled use of antibiotics because patients can't afford a whole course of treatment, then the bacteria-destroying effects of antibiotics will be ineffective. If people are worried about affording their medication, that is a barrier that holds them back from healing. Infections are life-threatening without access to high-quality antibiotics and the proper dosage of antimicrobial drugs. Overprescribing antibiotics is also a problem in both developed and developing countries that contributes to antibiotic resistance. If there was more control over the production and prescription of antibiotics globally, then there would be greater regulation of prescription medication, likely increasing their effects. Taking antibiotics only when it is deemed medically necessary can help to combat resistance. In an article from 1953 titled, "Are Wonder Drugs Losing Their Punch?" Dr. Waxman addresses the spreading worries of antibiotic resistance during the mid-20th century, but assures his readers that antibiotics are effective when used properly and not overprescribed. It is easy for patients to urge their doctor for a prescription, viewing antibiotics as a cure-all. However, it is sometimes necessary to drain serious infections that cannot be mitigated through antibiotics, especially before sepsis develops. I had a frightening experience with a lymph node infection that had to be surgically drained after 4 failed rounds of antibiotics to make sure that the infection did not go into my bloodstream, which is life-threatening. My doctor thought the antibiotics would kill the bacteria in my ping-pong-sized inflamed lymph node. When he didn't see any changes in the infection site after several months, he knew the antibiotics were not doing their job. I wonder if the antibiotics would have been effective if my body hadn't been exposed to them so often in the past. The infectious bacteria learned they could fight off the effects of antibiotics after being exposed to antimicrobials time and time again. Antibiotic resistance can happen to anyone, and I was lucky enough to have access to prompt medical care to treat my antibiotic-resistant infection. Developing substances that can be used simultaneously with antibiotics to enhance their effects and minimize resistance is crucial in the next stage of antibiotic development. In the journal article, Antibiotic Adjuvants, Rescuing Antibiotics from Resistance, Jared Wright introduces 2 classes of compounds that can help block antibiotic resistance. Wright maintains that Class 1 adjuvants inhibit active or intrinsic antibiotic resistance in bacteria, while Class 2 adjuvants enhance the host's ability to kill bacteria. To simplify, this means Class 1 works passively by blocking certain enzymes. An example of this is the inhibitor of beta-lactamase, which is responsible for inactivating the effects of antibiotics. Beta-lactamase is found in common antibiotics like penicillin, cephalexin, and amoxicillin. I can assure you that you or someone in your immediate family has been prescribed an antibiotic with the beta-lactamase enzyme. Class 2 adjuvants function actively by enhancing the host's ability to kill bacteria. Antibiotic adjuvants can help minimize resistance, but cannot eliminate resistance. Further research and discovery of antibiotic adjuvants must happen to decrease the spread and frequency of antibiotic resistance. I believe there is hope to be found, not just in the future expansion of modern medicine, but also in ancient healing methods. In the podcast staff retreat, the guests Christina Lee, a professor and historian, and Freya Harrison, who is a microbiologist, are both interested in infectious diseases. They share the findings of an old healer's book that includes the steps to make the, quote, best medicine, which successfully killed 99.99% of bacterial cells on mock wounds infected with staph. The medicine is a stew combining garlic, onion, wine, copper, and bile from a cow's gallbladder. This strange potion should not be disregarded for its bacteria-killing properties. If modern medicine dismisses old healing practices, then it cannot learn and develop from their promising antimicrobial qualities. Although some listeners may object to the prevalence and urgency of antibiotic resistance on the grounds that they have yet to experience it, those working in medical settings would reply that the threat of resistance is common. I wanted to learn more about antibiotic resistance in medical settings, so I interviewed Maya Van Hise, a nursing student at USM who also works as a certified nursing assistant on the wound and burn floor at Maine Medical Center, the largest hospital in Maine. What is something that surprises you about antibiotic resistance?
It could just be the floor that I'm on, but just how prevalent it is, like how many people have it. It really surprised me, like going into the hospital. I didn't really realize that would be such a big thing. And at the hospital, they used to fully gown up and glove up to go into somebody's room who has MRSA, and now they don't do any of that.
In a study published in the Journal of Infection and Public Health, the importance of hand hygiene in emergency departments is explored. A strong emphasis is put on hand washing to slow down the spread of antibiotic-resistant bacteria that is often carried by nurses and doctors caring for different patients. I think it is important to address these basic measures to avoid the spread and intensity of infection, because it is not only the job of antibiotics to kill harmful bacteria. The spread of infections in medical settings is common and needs to be mitigated by implementing strict hygiene codes. People are at risk of contracting antibiotic-resistant infections like Clostridium difficile, Clostridium difficile is transmittable and can be caused by antibiotic use, which causes an imbalance of bacteria in the gut. Probiotics are necessary to restore healthy gut bacteria. I think it's ironic that medicine made to heal people and fight infection can in turn cause another infection. Bacteria exist to protect us, so when antibiotics deplete the beneficial bacteria in our bodies, we are confronted with uncomfortable gastrointestinal symptoms. I wanted to know what Maya's experience was with combating C. diff on the wound and burn floor at Maine Med. Is C. diff something you were frequently combating at work?
When somebody has C. diff in the hospital, they're put on contact precautions, so you wear a gown and gloves every time you go into their room, and they're isolated into a single room. So normally, on my floor, we have double rooms, then we have a few single rooms. If anybody tests positive for C. diff, they're put into a single room. Unless somebody else on the floor has the same infection, then they're put together. They're put into a single room. They really, really, really stress hand hygiene with us, even regardless of whether or not you're wearing gloves. There are hand sanitizers outside of every single room. I think we have 4 sinks in the hallway on our unit. Every now and then somebody will be watching us to see if we're doing hand hygiene in and out of rooms. And then that statistic gets posted up on the wall on our unit.
What stuck with me after interviewing Maya was learning how common antibiotic resistance really is in medical settings. Maya feels the same way.
It's very, very surprising to me how many people in the hospital have antibiotic resistance. Wow. Whether that be MRSA, CRE, VRE, VRSA, I would say more than half.
But maybe we shouldn't be so shocked about the prevalence of antibiotic resistance. After all, antibiotic resistance is unavoidable, but the measures we take to reduce the effects of antibiotic resistance will save millions of lives. It is the responsibility of pharmaceutical companies to invest in further development of antibiotics instead of shying away from investing in research out of fear of losing profit. In the journal article, Origins of Antibiotics and Antibiotic Resistance and Their Impacts on Drug Development, the primary author, Ghazala Mutib, critiques the diminishing efforts to develop new antibiotics. She explains that crafting a novel antibiotic is a protracted and costly endeavor, which has led to a diminished enthusiasm for innovation in this vital medical domain. The pattern of antibiotic resistance following the development of an antibiotic has resulted in the pharmaceutical short duration in comparison to drugs that treat chronic illness, which further contributes to a less profitable market. Offering economic and tax incentives to pharmaceutical companies for antibiotic research and development is necessary for improving the quality of future antibiotics to properly combat this pressing health threat. Those in critical condition are often at the highest risk of mortality during a global health crisis. We saw this play out during COVID-19, with the elderly and ill at the highest risk of dying from the coronavirus. My point here is that antibiotic resistance especially targets vulnerable populations and should interest those in helping professions, whether that be doctors, nurses, teachers, or even social workers who can work with patients who should speak to anyone who cares about the larger issue of saving lives from the global health threat of antibiotic resistance. From improving hygiene codes in hospitals to pressuring pharmaceutical companies to further develop antibiotics and antibiotic adjuvants, we all play a part in reducing the spread of antibiotic-resistant bacteria. Additionally, we must not overlook ancient and natural remedies for killing rapidly proliferating pathogens. No one is fully protected from antibiotic resistance, and implementing solutions to managing the spread of antibiotic resistance may save your life or the life of someone you love someday.